So at the height of his 2374 experiences, Philip K. Dick made a phone call to the Fullerton Police Department. He told them he was a dangerous machine and that he needed to be incarcerated before his programming forced him to do something destructive. Phil's aversion to the police wasn't absolute, but this event still stands out. He must have had a pretty good reason to narc on himself. So what pushed him to tell the police that he was a deadly android? I found 3 different narratives of this event from Phil's own pen or typewriter. The earliest is a letter to Claudia Bush dated July 30th, 1974, and it's in the context of describing a series of dreams that he felt were urging him to get in touch with Diane Kennedy Pike, the widow of Bishop James Pike. So Phil writes, quote, "The imperative was so overriding at first that when I saw an ad for a Christian missionary group, I immediately pulled a $5 from my wallet and sent it to them with my name, address, and phone number. Diane was a Christian missionary before meeting Jim. You can see why I answered the ad. And at the time I knew that I, PKD, would never answer that ad. I knew a will terribly overriding was in control of me. I must tell you this, Claudia. After I mailed that $5, I was so sure I was being programmed by an alien will that, believe it or not, I phoned the police, had them come, and told them someone had control of me and to lock me up. After initial skepticism, he convinces the police that he's not a crackpot, and he says they went away sobered after shaking hands with me and wishing me luck." So in the letter to Claudia, this sounds more than a little bit like a joke, but entries in the Exegesis suggest that this was an actual event, though he never really gives a detailed account of it. This is kind of a problem throughout the Exegesis. Is he's good at saying, oh, that time that this happened, and not actually good at writing out the story. But he talks about, makes several references to a Sergeant Kelly, so that's kind of like the key word to search for if you're looking for this story, to whom he confessed being a machine. One entry suggests that this was in the context of seeing the King Felix cipher, so the pair of juxtaposed words in the first edition of Flow My Tears, the policeman said that Phil imbued with a portentous meaning. But most of the references to Sergeant Kelly relate to the most likely pretext for this phone call to the Fullerton Police, his receipt in March 1974 of what he called the Xerox missive. So the clearest depiction of this event is in Valis. That's a fictional setting, so you should take that as a grain of salt, though there is some external confirmation of the account that's given there. So in the novel, Horse Lover Fat has a series of ominous dreams leading up to a day when a letter arrives in the mail with no name or return address on the envelope. Fat is terrified of this letter, and he instructs his wife Beth to open it but not to let him see the contents. Inside the envelope is a photocopied book review from a socialist newspaper. Tessa Dick elaborates that many of the words in the real-life counterpart of this letter were underlined. She says, quote, "All were what Phil called die messages, words like decline, decay, stagnation, decomposition," unquote. She also confirms that he had feared for weeks that he was going to receive a letter that would kill him. In Valis, narrator Phil pleads ignorance as to what happened with this letter. He says, quote, "What he did with the letter, with the Xerox letter, I do not to this day know, nor do I want to know. Maybe he burned it. Maybe he turned it over to the police or the FBI or the CIA. In any case, I doubt if he answered it," unquote. This ambiguity is kind of fascinating and really suggestive. If the character Phil does not know what Fat did, that kind of implies that Philip K. Dick, the author, may have similarly not really known what his own response to this event had been. But it seems that Phil's reaction, or at least in part, was the event obliquely described in the Exegesis. He called the local police and told them he was a dangerous machine. He was overwhelmed with anxiety about the possibility that he was not in control of himself, and his fear that, like Spence Olam in the story Imposter, he was masquerading as a human on Earth in order to destroy it. Throughout the Exegesis, Phil speculates on the meaning of the Xerox missive, operating on the assumptions that his response to the letter was being monitored by some outside force, that there was an expected outcome from this letter being sent and received, and that his reaction was not the anticipated one. He consistently expresses the belief that his response to the Xerox letter was unpredictable and disrupted the anticipated chain of events. If he accepted the premise that he was or could be controlled, then the unpredictability of his response broke the programming, establishing, in the terms of the 1972 speech, The Android and the Human, that he was a human and not a reflex machine after all. In Dick's explorations of the Xerox missive in the Exegesis, he relates this episode to astral determinism, hymarmony or fate, and pronoia or providence, all terms drawn from the milieu of Hellenistic philosophy and religion. And he explores the possibility that his experiences signaled liberation, whether his or the entire world's, from the bonds of fate. The idea that the stars predict or control human destiny is an ancient one with roots in earliest astronomy. P.G. Maxwell Stewart, a historian of magic and the occult, credits Stoic philosophers, in particular Zeno of Citium, with theorizing an explanation for how the stars are connected to mundane events through sympathies between the heavens and the earth. Maxwell Stewart summarizes the Stoic cosmology, quote, "The universe as a whole obeys one set of divine laws, and this means that connections or sympathies between the various parts can either be seen or worked out, and that because of this, comment can be made on the individual conditions of those various parts by taking into consideration the nature and type of the sympathy between each one and the rest. Consequently, the stars and the planets may be held to have connections with, and therefore an influence upon, human beings," unquote. So in Stoic philosophy, this astral determinism is not a source of anxiety, but it's an answer to it. In the face of the possibility that the universe is governed by mere chance, it posits an ordered plan. So Stoics called this universal fate hymarmony. The beneficent plan according to which it operated was pronoia, or providence, but they're both good things in Stoic philosophy. Stoicism became an enormously influential philosophical system during the Hellenistic period and the early Roman Empire, but as its influence spread, it encountered other worldviews and schools of thought that adapted its terminology to slightly different use. Seeking to offer a more satisfying answer to the question of unjust fate, Middle Platonist authors like Pseudo-Plutarch and Apuleius distinguished between the divine guidance of pronoia, which produced positive outcomes, and the lower, more capricious hymarmony, which is blamed for unjust destinies. So there's a kind of splitting of the two different kinds of fate from these two words. Several texts from the Hermetic tradition, so religious, philosophical, and scientific texts originating in Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt that are associated with the legendary figure of Hermes Trismegistus, carry this impulse even further, associating hymarmony with all manner of demonic forces and spiritual punishment. Rather than a benevolent system with which to align oneself, as in the Stoic system, fate thus becomes a force to be resisted. Similar ideas to this appear in the diverse body of texts and religious movements that some modern scholars, following the lead of ancient heresiologists, have grouped together under the single rubric of Gnosticism. It's largely tangential to my topic here, but I'm convinced by the critical cases presented by scholars of religion like Michael Allen Williams and Karen L. King, both of whom contend that the modern idea of a single Gnosticism obscures more than it reveals about a variety of ancient religious movements and texts. Some of these texts, though, that are grouped this way, including several of the books found near Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, depict the malevolent rulers of the cosmos, or archons, as enslaving humanity through the elements and stars. In his book, The Gnostic Religion, existentialist philosopher Hans Jonas presents a picture of archontic texts as obsessed with the control of the pitiless sky, which has become a source of existential terror. By the time he wrote Valis, Dick was aware of the Nag Hammadi library, but I've only been able to find concrete evidence that he read a single text from it on the origin of the world, which he quotes directly in Valis. But fate, or hymarmony, plays a role in this text, appearing as the archon's colleague in the mission of leading human beings into error. But texts like this don't just describe the enslaving powers of the stars, they also describe the salvific forces that break these bonds. And you'll have to bear with me or indulge me here for a minute. I've been studying Coptic for a few years, almost entirely so I can do things like this. So I'm going to get into the Coptic just a little bit because I just think it's a really cool language, and this passage in particular is really neat. But one of the texts from Nag Hammadi, the Trimorphic Protonoia, which is a great Nag Hammadi type name, but it just means first thought in three forms, presents a monologue from a divine salvific force called Protonoia, or first thought. Protonoia describes her three descents into the world of matter, which have a devastating effect on, specifically, the courses of the planets. So this passage here describes this, quote, "The lots of fate," and the word there is hymarmony, which is just transcribed from Greek into Coptic, "and those that measure the houses of the zodiac were greatly disturbed on account of a devastating thunder. And the thrones of the powers were disturbed, being displaced, and their king was afraid. And those that run after fate," i.e. the planets, "gave up their degrees of rotation on the path," like the ecliptic, "and they said to the powers, 'What is this disturbance? It has moved our entire house, and the whole rotation of our path of ascent has come to ruin. And the path on which we go, which takes us up to the archigenitor of our birth, has ceased to be established for us," unquote. So Protonoia's entrance into the created world disturbs this enslaving order, which is presented in explicitly astrological terms. But the result of this is liberation for human beings. The idea that cosmic forces have freed a select group from the domination of fate is not limited to archontic and demiurgic texts alone. Liberation from cosmic fate is a key theme in the Pauline corpus, placing the idea at the heart of the New Testament. Several of the Pauline and Deutero-Pauline letters use a vocabulary of authority that describes powers against which Christ and the early church struggled, including stoicheia tou kosmou, often translated as elemental forces, elemental spirits, or fundamental principles of the world. Paul links these powers and forces with bondage and control. And as with the trimorphic protonoia, Paul immediately turns from this idea of enslavement to liberation, describing an incarnational salvation from precisely these elements. It's important to note that there's no indication that Paul linked these elemental forces directly to the astral powers of Hellenistic philosophy, the stars and planets specifically, but nevertheless, some of Paul's interpreters in both ancient and modern times have linked this language of power to astral determinism. So Theodotus, a member of the Valentinian tradition, one of those Gnostic groups, identified the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places in Ephesians 6:12 as, quote, cosmic powers, including those that motivate the stars and planets, unquote. And to bring it back to Phil finally, his preferred Bible translation, the Jerusalem Bible, which is a 1966 translation undertaken by a group of Jesuit scholars, explicitly identifies Paul's opponents as believers in astrology. The Jerusalem Bible's footnotes and commentary on both Colossians and Ephesians make a case for Paul as a believer, if not in astrology specifically, then at least in the basic principle of an astrological determinism that could be defeated by Christ's intervention. So even if Paul's direct engagement with astrological concepts is uncertain, his later interpreters, including those who influenced Phil, have seen a direct link between his discussion of determinism and control and the most prominent theories about fate in the centuries after he was writing. So Dick's Exegesis is a contentious document, and material relating to the Xerox missive in particular provides ample evidence for those who wish to dismiss his experiences and his textual responses to them as delusional. Lawrence Sutton describes specifically those sections about the Xerox missive as generating, quote, much heat but rather little light, unquote. And Jay Kinney, who was one of the text's first editors, might have been thinking of these same passages when he described portions of the text as, quote, akin to watching a good friend repeatedly bang his head against the wall, unquote. But nevertheless, it's precisely this topic that led to Dick's discussion of fatalism. So the concept of astral determinism emerges pretty early in the exegesis, and it soon becomes a core theme, perhaps better described as a recurring anxiety, and remained a frequent presence throughout the entire course of the 8-year project. What seems to be Dick's first reference to the phrase is in this 1975 passage, where it appears in a transcribed quotation from the Encyclopedia Britannica's Macropedia article on Gnosticism. Key to this thread of thinking was the idea that Dick's reaction to the Xerox letter was somehow out of his own control, or rather wrested him out of the control under which he'd been suffering. Dick consistently refers to his actions regarding the Xerox letter, his refusal to read it, thus carrying out whatever pre-programmed actions it might have compelled him to do, as an extraordinary event. His sense that the letter was connected to some kind of malevolent exterior force is contrasted with his conviction that he'd been taken over by a benevolent agent, that transcendent rational mind, the ultimate identity of which is another central theme of the exegesis. This is summarized in a 1977 entry that describes God's mighty act of freeing him from a unfree and deterministic plan by causing him to do something I would never do. But this is just not reading a letter, right? He's making something very small into something very big. But rather than a predetermined or predictable action, his response was, quote, something new, although tiny, bordering on ex nihilo, on nothing, introduced into an otherwise closed system, unquote. He elsewhere just summarizes this as actions without a history. So if hymariny is the chain of causation, the sequence of A leading to B and B leading to C, Dick's refusal to read the Xerox missive represents an action outside of that causality, A leading instead to a character from another alphabet entirely. And even in this minuscule action was enough to disrupt the causality of the entire universe in this line of thinking. So Dick's reaction to the Xerox letter is one example of a kind of balking. So this is an idea that he talks about a lot in the exegesis, that is for kind of like an instinctive rejection of some part of the logic of the universe. But rather than a moral balking, the big example of that is his participation in the tax strike organized by Ramparts magazine to protest the Vietnam War. This represents an intellectual balking, which James Burton, in a really great book called, I believe, Philosophy and Science Fiction, but it's specifically about Philip K. Dick and Henri Bergson. He summarizes intellectual balking as, quote, the capacity to conceive of a world other than the mundane reality before one's eyes, unquote. Accepting the visible world as truly real naturally leads to accepting its rules and obeying its orders. Phil's tax protest was rooted in a moral stance against the Vietnam War. In comparison, the refusal to read a letter with no real knowledge of its contents is a strange decision, in part because it is so small a choice, bordering on ex nihilo. It's a delightful misuse of that phrase, but I love it. But it's perhaps because of the insignificance of that action that it rose to such importance in his later thinking. It's a symbol of the disruption of his place in reality and the beginning of the process of repositioning and reordering his life. In a sense, it doesn't even matter if there really was a sinister motive behind the Xerox letter. If the goal is simply to demonstrate a refusal of the world as perceived, then virtually any experience could provide an opportunity for such rejection. Moreover, Phil makes it clear that the moral and epistemological puzzles that the universe contains betray no sign of their presence. In the created universe, the lower realm, these transcendent opportunities are concealed and camouflaged. Their true importance is only apparent within, quote, another invisible landscape at odds with the palpable one, unquote. What's important to Dick is the element of the unexpected, of bucking causality and introducing an action that the controlling forces of the universe had not anticipated. Phil uses the metaphor of a sound recording at several points in the exegesis to describe the deterministic world in which we're trapped, comparing the universe we experience to an LP groove, wherein the contents of the past, present, and future are all determined and absolute. Actions without a history, like those Phil undertook during 2374, override this groove, producing new music outside of that contained in the pre-existent recording. This idea reaches its fullest exploration in an essay within the exegesis with the wonderful title, The Ultra-Hidden Cryptic Doctrine, the Secret Meaning of the Great Systems of Theosophy of the World, Openly Revealed for the First Time. I love those titles. In this text, Dick theorizes about the nature and cause of this groove override, which he abbreviates GO, and its relationship to a new free merit deed, or NFMD. He speculates that the benevolent forces of the universe will allow the overriding of the groove only where they know that a new positive action will take place of what the groove contained. This means that such an experience is an example of the science-fictional idea known as the bootstrap paradox. Quote, both GO and NFMD are generated within a closed system out of nothing and enter from nowhere, i.e. from outside the system. Put even more simply, how can you do something you would not do, unquote. Elsewhere, Phil describes a 1979 hypnagogic experience that provides him with another metaphor for this disruption of fate. It's a dream in which he sees a system of punishment where people are tried and punished for the sins that are listed on a document, like a bill of particulars against them. But they can be saved by an external force. Quote, if the messenger arrives in time with the blank document, your punishment is abolished. I.e. the blank white paper is substituted for the bill of particulars that lists the sins for which you're being tried and punished. Phil's description of this dream appears after dozens of pages in which he's talking about Torah, or law, as a source of deterministic control. And his language in this preceding section explicitly echoes Paul's letters, in particular Galatians 3, where Paul is talking about the curse of the law under which we are imprisoned and guarded. It's the same kind of control language that Paul uses about the forces of the cosmos. Dick incorporates this messenger dream into this ongoing discussion. So he's been writing, he goes to sleep, has this dream, continues writing, and now the dream is kind of added into the thought he had already been writing about. This puts the messenger, which he identifies as Christ, in between the Torah and the punishing system, and directly relating the image to Martin Luther's theology. So Eric Davis in High Weirdness calls this an almost bureaucratic parallel of the spotless Lamb of Christ, with the blank sheet jamming the machinery of ontological control. Phil relates similar ideas about Paul, the law, and control to astral determinism in another 1979 exegesis passage, where he writes, quote, astral determinism, what Paul calls the old law or planetary powers, have been cheated of their victim due to the surrogative divine intervention of God, Christ. Again, they fell for the hook of divinity hidden in the bait of humanity. This is the mechanism by which Christianity successfully accomplishes what all the Greco-Roman mystery religions sought for and promised, the escape by the initiate from astral determinism or untimely death, unquote. So Dick makes this connection through a creative misquoting. Nowhere in the language of cosmic control does Paul refer directly to the planetary powers of astrology, as Dick has him saying here. He may have been drawing on that connection from the Jerusalem Bible's association of Paul's language with astrology, but whatever the source of this misquotation, Phil is correct to see Paul's understanding of the law and Christ's interaction with it as having to do with liberation. He goes further in explicitly identifying untimely death as the deterministic fate from which this liberation frees us. The initiate, so emancipated, lives on past the moment of pre-programmed death, but is now transformed. Quote, he can be killed, but not on cue, i.e. schedule. Meanwhile, he retains a mental symbiosis with his brother, Christ, unquote. In other words, the transformed person has now been born again as a being symbiotic with the divine. In this interpretation, the Xerox missive threatened Dick with death, but through the beneficent power's usurpation of his life, he instead underwent an ego death and rebirth. Dick's ideas about control and liberation emerged within a broader societal context of social anxiety. Timothy Melly has talked about this kind of fear of control, which he calls agency panic, defined as, quote, intense anxiety about an apparent loss of autonomy, the conviction that one's actions are being controlled by someone else, or that one has been constructed by powerful external agents, unquote. And for Melly, this is something that is kind of propagating itself throughout culture in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. Eric Davis explores this theme, noting in particular the role of paranoia as an externalized agency panic in the work of Robert Anton Wilson. Wilson's writings draw on a post-war culture of conspiracism that looks for signs of control in social forces and outside institutions. Though Dick's experiences emerged at the same time that this externalized agency panic was developing in culture, his paranoia remained primarily internalized. So the same sense that oneself is not under one's own control appears as well in the work of William S. Burroughs. Davis notes that Burroughs is the most frequently cited contemporary author in the exegesis. In Dick's notes, Burroughs' name, as most names in the exegesis, become shorthand for something. So for Burroughs, it's shorthand for the particular theory advanced in The Ticket That Exploded, that language is an alien virus intended to control and imprison all human beings. In his speech, The Android and the Human, Dick gives a list of techniques for disrupting social control that's really similar to that Burroughs gives in his book, The Electronic Revolution. But while both Wilson and Burroughs engage directly with occult magical practices in connection with their interest in disrupting systems of control, Dick's focus was primarily inward, suggesting that it is the individual more than the universe that is subject to malevolent control. Dick's anxiety over fatalism precedes his 2374 experiences and is reflected in his earlier use of the I Ching, or Book of Changes, an ancient Chinese divination manual. Most scholarly attention to Dick's use of the I Ching has focused on its role both within the text of and in the production of The Man in the High Castle. But he was broadly interested in the text and used it throughout his life. Dick summarizes his understanding of the I Ching in the 1965 essay, Schizophrenia in the Book of Changes, here in the lovely Philip K. Dick Society edition, which was heavily influenced by Carl Jung's foreword to the Bollingen edition of the I Ching. Dick argues that the Book of Changes does not predict the future per se, but rather gives its user a quote, absolute total presentation of a pattern representing the entire koinos cosmos at this Augenblick, or moment, unquote. Philosopher Cheng-Ying Cheng offers a similar description of the goal of Chinese divination methods, including those used in the Book of Changes, as well as the reading of oracle bones, which is a very old practice in Chinese culture. Both of which produce, quote, a cosmic map that provides a detailed guide on how things may develop and how reality could be described, and a way of identifying the present situation. Jung specifically defines such practices in contrast to deterministic causality, so grain of salt there, referring instead to an acausal or synchronistic connective principle underlying divination practices like the I Ching. So in this essay, Dick presents two parallel tracks along which the I Ching can be used. One of those shows the influence of Jung, so he calls it a measured approach, wherein the oracle can provide the kind of surprise that Dick views as essential for warding off control in The Android and the Human. But he also suggests that there is a second approach that can predict the future, but it can only do so if you are interpreting it too deeply, interpreting too deeply that accurate picture of the koinos cosmos that it's producing. So Dick calls this predictive approach schizophrenic. That's in our title there for that essay. And he says that using the Yi Jing in this way means that you're giving into an insane understanding of reality as ossified and unchangeable. Quote, "It would be a greater loss than gain. We would have induced our future into being consumed by the present, because once the future is gone, the possibility of free, effective action of any kind is abolished," unquote. Dick's delineation of the tension between these two approaches reveals the pull of both on his own use of divinatory techniques. And Dick suggests that his use of the Yi Jing was a daily occurrence that bordered on obsessive, suggesting just this kind of entrapment by the lure of prediction. And it's this kind of perception of the macrocosm within the microcosm that makes Regal Gum, the protagonist of the earlier Time Out of Joint, valuable to the society that entraps him. His ability to determine where the missile attacks will occur in the war between the Earth and the Moon, camouflaged in his false reality as solving a daily newspaper puzzle, consists precisely in producing an accurate, synchronistic picture of the war's present situation. But he also speaks of the Jungian synchronistic approach to divination, this Phil, not Regal, as providing the opportunity to experience happy accidents that enable fictive creation, perhaps nowhere so notably as in the use of the Yi Jing and the composition of Man in the High Castle. In the Exegesis, Dick's view of determinism is similarly bifurcated, so this time into a before and after. Prior to the invention of the benevolent exterior force, he was subject to a rigid fate that was leading him to destruction. And after his rescue from the Xerox missive, he was free to live and create new free actions outside of that groove of malevolent programming. Historian of religion Nicola Denzi Lewis identifies three main approaches in early Orthodox and heterodox Christian texts to the question of fatalism and astral control. Quote, "While some Christian thinkers developed a system of arguments against the idea of something like astral fatalism, others adopted the idea of astral fatalism into a discourse of alterity, whereby some were enslaved by fate, but others were free. Still others adopted the idea that while they themselves had once been enslaved by fate, they were now free," unquote. Dick's thinking in the Exegesis epitomizes this final approach. Dick's comments on astral determinism and fate are like those found in early Christian critiques of astrology, which Lewis argues do not grow from the conviction that the stars control all human destiny. In the Exegesis, Dick explored the question of fate precisely to work out the feeling of freedom from an android past that his experiences had produced. Jeffrey Kripal describes a creative response to paranormal experiences that he calls authorization, which, quote, "begins when we decide to step out of the script of the story we find ourselves caught in and write ourselves," unquote. Kripal frames Dick as an exemplar of this process of authorization, creating through self-examination an understanding of, quote, "both the ultimate nature of human freedom and the deeper mechanisms of evolution," unquote. In Dick's Exegesis, and especially those sections concerning astral determinism, fate, or karma, he rewrites both his experiences and his self, taking control of a pre-programmed narrative to produce a new script, a new action, a new identity. In the concept of balking, he encapsulates the moment of liberation in which the needle is forced out of the groove and the opportunity for free action becomes available to the de-androidized subject. These discussions in the Exegesis form a discourse of liberation in which Dick seeks to understand both the control to which he feared being subjected and the sense of liberation that his experience of disjunction and rebirth had granted him.